Andrew Clennell joins me now from Sydney. Let's start there if we can, Andrew. What's your sense of it in terms of how the community in New South Wales think the government's handling this caseload? There was a lot of debate in morning media in Sydney about these flights that are coming from Melbourne to Sydney and whether or not, people are tested as they should be on the borders. We know that road border is closed. How well are authorities managing airports, do you think?
Well, the majority of people are Sydney-siders returning from Melbourne. But the opposition in New South Wales is obviously saying everyone should go to hotel quarantine as you do from overseas. That kind of makes a bit of sense. The suggestion to me is health assesses people at the airport. If they think there are cases worthy of going to hotel quarantine, they do. Others are asked to self-isolate. But I think the evidence seems to show, perhaps fortunately given there's 3 or 4 flights a day, that the majority of cases are from existing clusters, which originally came up from Victoria, but they're from clusters associated with those various premises, whether it be Mounties or the Thai Rock restaurant and so forth. So they seem to be keeping it under control. I think I said the other day there was about a 3 in 50,000 case, 50,000 test rate in, or 3 in 5,000 in New South Wales and 3 in 100 in Victoria. As long as the numbers are small enough that they can find all the contacts and isolate, the economy can stay open, essentially, but there's more talk now about wearing masks a bit more. But, yeah, people see the flights as a vulnerability. The other argument that's been put to me on that is that if you just stop the flights, there's 55 border entries into New South Wales, so they're harder to police.
Yeah, I get that point, but if you're talking about, say, 4 or 5, and originally there were 17 flights planned for today, I know a number were cancelled, but let's assume those flights, those 4 or 5 flights are full. You're talking about 1,000 to 1,500 people a day. That's way more that were coming, even at the height of the pandemic, coming from overseas. All of those went through hotel quarantine. The disease doesn't distinguish whether you've come from Manila or whether you've come from Melbourne. I don't understand why New South Wales will take the risk when you look at what's happening in Victoria. And you look at the statistics, actually, in Victoria, that so many people, when they knock on the door, they're not home, they're not self-isolating, they're not doing what they should do. And in those cases, they're actually positive.
Yeah, well, the planes are socially distant, so I don't think you'd be looking at full planes. But aside from that, what you say makes a fair bit of sense. And perhaps a charge could be levied on those who want to come back. Because if you're from Sydney and you haven't come back so far, I mean, maybe you've got some essential business, that's the other thing. But why aren't you back by now? So I think there's potentially an argument around that. But I think the hard border closure down south has made a big difference. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But, I mean, the AHPPC advice is clear. All the medical officers from around the country believed that one of the reasons the hard lockdown was necessary in Victoria, this awful stage 4, is there was real risk of outbreaks elsewhere in the country. It's hoped this can get a lid on Victoria and save the rest of the country.
Well, talk to me just quickly about masks in New South Wales, because that's still a debating point.
Yes, it is. And I guess Gladys Berejiklian, with the numbers so low, is resisting the urge to go mandatory masks. I suspect a lot of the Liberal base in her party room would object to going mandatory masks at this early point. But there's no doubt that will be something that will occur prior to shutdowns. That's kind of the information you get from the New South Wales government. They're very keen not to shut down the economy. Mandatory masks would be first, and mandatory masks will come into force, Peter, if they believe there are too many clusters going on. So it's not even about cases, it's about the clusters. It's just getting more and more widespread. So we'll see what happens. I mean, the Premier looks concerned. She's saying that these are critical weeks. Everything hinges on what happens in those weeks. People are being told at Bunnings, supermarkets, etc., to wear them on public transport. You get about a 10% uptake that way. Mandatory, you'll get a lot bigger uptake, but it's a watching brief. We know that a month ago there were 75 and then 100 cases, and then it just absolutely went through the roof in Victoria. That hasn't been the experience so far here. It's stuck at a sort of stubborn 18 to 25 cases a day.
Yeah, and I think that's because your contact tracing in New South Wales is exceptional compared to Victoria. Your test results come back in 24, 48 hours.
That's right.
We know it's up to 9 days in Victoria. So the infrastructure around this disease or this virus in New South Wales is far more precise and and timely than it is in Victoria. So that's probably another thing in your favour, but I'd be watching it closely. You don't want to end up like they are in Victoria. I want to go to this issue of the hotel quarantine debacle, this inquiry, so-called independent inquiry, so-called judicial inquiry. I don't know, it's so judicial because it doesn't have all the powers that you'd expect of a judicial inquiry. It's expected, we're told, to hear evidence that some of the poorly trained security guards may have let hysterical guests escape into the community. What do you think of that report?
Well, I just think it's all true, Peter. To be honest with you, all the reports that I've heard, it was a health operation, not a police operation like New South Wales. The Victorian Authorities themselves and the inquiry has heard that every single case in Victoria could be traced to that. It is an absolute debacle, and it's a little wonder when you hear, you know, I mean, Daniel Andrews is out there saying there's a $5,000 fine if you leave isolation if you got COVID-19. Last week, their Chief Health Officer, Brett Sutton, said we don't do detention and you can still leave your house for exercise if you have COVID-19. That's just absolutely unbelievable. And if that was the public health attitude towards that quarantine operation, that somehow your rights, so-called rights, trump the health of the entire state, that's insane,
but
Peter, to be honest with you.
All the way along. They're literally making it up as they go along. And there's you know, a lot of experts yesterday, epidemiologists and others, are wanting to see more of the modelling and more of the health data, more of the information so that there's contestability. But the Premier's been saying all the way along, I listen to my experts and I'll do what my experts tell him. Well, he's in a bit of a bother now, isn't he? Because he's listened to these experts all along. They ain't been that expert. Yeah,
my colleague Kieran Gilbert, I mean, he heard that there was some friction between Andrews and Sutton, and I think this issue sort of represents that today. But as one federal source said to me, Peter, quarantine is quarantine. It means you do not leave that area where you are quarantined. That is the definition of quarantine. And look, it's a health and emergency response at the moment, but I think the issue will become one very heavily again for Daniel Andrews if hopefully they get on top of this thing. This will all be revisited. I mean, no matter what sort of inquiry it is, it'll just come to some inevitable truce, which is it's the state government's fault.
Yeah, we'll see what happens, and we'll see if they even front. Andrew Clennell, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Peter.